I simply can't believe how many times people have came up to me and said, wow, you're learning Mandarin Chinese? That's gonna be like the hardest language in the world. And every time I'm like, no, it's definitely not. When you see somebody who doesn't know what the they're talking about, they're gonna be like, oh yeah, Mandarin's harder than Japanese because Japanese has like less characters than Mandarin. And Mandarin has tones, and those have to be so hard, and just shut up. You be quiet, you. And that's because it's Japanese. I've always wanted to explain why Japanese is harder than Chinese, but if you can't tell by the length of this video, it'd be pretty hard to explain it in a small amount of time. And I tried to condense this the best I could, so just bear with me here. It's very weird to me to just go ahead and say that Japanese is the hardest language without looking at other languages and saying why those are not the hardest. Simply put, this is the hardest language for English speakers, because the hardest language for anybody ever would have to be something that is constructed to be really hard. That being Quiplash. Quiplash is a language so ridiculously complex that not even the creator speaks it. It has a different writing system, it uses a bunch of sounds, and also you can't really speak it with anybody, so like what's the point? Is there any drive to learn that language? If you want to learn a bit more about Quiplash, there's a really good half as interesting video on it. But don't make me explain anything, I don't even think I pronounced the name of the language right. But obviously saying that is kind of a cheat of an answer. It was made by somebody. It was made to be hard. Saying Quiplash is the hardest language is like saying, I wonder which rock is the hardest, and then some stupid science bitch comes up to you and says, oh, it's this rock that I made. Like, bro, I get it, your rock is hard. I want a regular rock, not one of your stupid rocks. But if you know anything about rocks, and I don't know anything about rocks, the smallest rocks are the hardest, I think, maybe. That means the hardest language to speak is Limerick, which is spoken in Vanuatu. Limerick is a language with only 2 speakers, and despite the fact that there are copies of the language lying around, there isn't enough to learn the language. But then again, that's pretty much a cheat of an answer. It only has 2 speakers. And I know that's not what you want to hear. You want to hear a big name like how Russian is the hardest language, or how some language from India is the hardest language. The thing is, I had a couple reasons why that isn't the case written up on my script here, but there's one big problem. These languages have things like alphabets, and things that are similar to alphabets. The thing with both Mandarin and Japanese is that they don't. They have kanji. Kanji are also called Hansa, and I made a whole video on this before. Essentially, there are thousands in each language, and you need to learn those to be able to speak it and understand it. With that in mind, it's obvious that these characters are the biggest threat to your learning. Because you can learn an alphabet, but you can't learn kanji. So with the ideas of the complex characters here, it's obvious that Japanese and Mandarin would seem to be the hardest languages. After all, they're completely unrelated to English. But obviously, I think Japanese is harder. So let me explain to you why Mandarin Chinese is not the hardest language.
And why it's Japanese.
So in this battle between 2 complex languages, let's begin with the basics. I'm going to talk about different basic things in the languages, and then I'm going to extrapolate on them and explain how they get harder over time. And then we'll talk about the basics on a different topic and rinse and repeat. When it comes to any language, the basics are the most important part. That's because the simplest and most important questions like where is the bathroom or can I have some bread are going to be formed with basic sentence structure. Speaking of bread, let's just form a simple sentence with that. I eat bread. This is as simple as you can get. It's a subject, a verb, and an object. At least in English. When it comes to Chinese, it is the exact same thing. It's literally, word for word, I eat bread. The only weird thing here is that the word for bread is a wheat roll in Chinese. But even then, considering how words are formed in Chinese, that's very regular. So, okay, Japanese has got to be pretty simple too. So what is it? Well, it's a little more difficult to explain. The word for I is commonly dropped in Japanese, because if you say this version of I, it sounds too feminine. So the beginning of the sentence is just bread. Which, if you know English, how would you know, what? Well, considering that you know English, we obviously skipped over something. Eat. Because it's not I bread eat in English, it's I eat bread. But in Japanese, it is I bread eat. The word for to eat is at the end here, taberu. But even then, we have an extra little hanging piece. That's a particle. Also known as the hell on earth. This particle, o, indicates the object of an action, which means that it's the direct object. Oh well, you don't know what those mean? Too bad, you have to learn grammatical terms to learn Japanese too. So, to recap, the Chinese sentence is literally I eat bread, but the Japanese sentence is bread o eat. I think you can see the basic problem here. Chinese is a very fortunate language for English speakers, because the grammar is surprisingly similar. But as you can tell with Japanese, the grammar is very alien to us. Let's look at a more advanced sentence just to show you how drastic the contrast is in between Chinese and Japanese, especially when compared to English. This sentence being North Korea uses nuclear weapons to threaten other nations. In Japanese, it is literally North Korea, particle, nuclear weapons, particle, to threaten, particle, And finally the verb to use. So, North Korea, particle, nuclear weapons, particle, threaten, particle, use. It's obviously clunky in English. So, what's the Chinese sentence? Oh, you're funny, because it's the exact same thing from English. It is literally, North Korea uses nuclear weapons to threaten other nations. There is no change. Literally, no change. And I got this verified by native Chinese speakers. This isn't just me guessing. This is it. This is the right way to say this.
Bruh.
So now, let's ignore the characters for a second and move on to the pronunciation. As I mentioned before, Chinese has this thing called tones. Essentially, they're variations in sound that show off the meaning of a word. But Japanese does not have these tones. So considering that these tones are kind of foreign to us, you'd think Japanese would get the point. But here's the thing. These tones actually help you a lot with listening. For example, a word in Japanese that means I has the exact same sound as time. However, in Chinese, if we were to assume that these words existed in Chinese, would have different tones to distinguish them. So while it might be easy to mess yourself up in Japanese, it's a little harder for that to happen in Mandarin. These tones are concise and allow you to understand things through listening quite easily. As a matter of fact, when I took the AAPPL, which is a test I can take in my state to see how fluent I am in any language, I was actually fluent in listening by the time I took it. And that was with 15 months of being self-taught. I'm not fluent enough in Japanese to tell you how easy it is to listen to things, but I can tell you right now, and I'll talk more about this later, that if you read a character in Japanese, it can have multiple sounds, and it often will. So it's quite easy to misread words. But whenever I look at a word in Chinese, I can just read it. So if you misread the word for singer as kate, because the word hand can sound like te or sho, and you hear the word kate being used, you might mistake it for the word singer, when it actually means food. These characters do have a consistency, but we will talk about that later, and we'll also talk about how it isn't that consistent. Also, let's look at the transliteration systems for both languages. In Chinese, we have pinyin, which was made in the 1950s. However, Japanese kana has been around for millennia, so this means that there are characters that sound weird. For example, the character O that I talked about earlier doesn't sound like wo, it just sounds like O. There's a couple more like that, that being wa, which is also ha, and a, which is also hey. But pinyin doesn't really have any weird things to it. You just have to get used to how it works. I would also like to note that some characters that are completely consistent can change when next to other characters. This mainly being the vowels. For example, the character A and the character E, when combined together, actually don't make the sound A, they make the sound A. So the E is made longer by the I, but it doesn't make an A sound, it makes an A sound for some reason. However, pinyin doesn't have this inconsistency. So, to summarize for pronunciation, there are a bunch of weird things going on in Japanese with their characters, but Chinese is simple, and you can easily listen to it, and read it. Which is kinda crazy when you think about it, because you should just be able to read things when you can see them, but whatever. Okay, look, I'm a little over 8 minutes into this video and I haven't talked about them yet. The kanji, or the Han characters. And the reason is quite simple. This topic is complex to deal with. To clarify, both languages use this system of writing known as the Han characters. And simply put, Japanese takes a lot less characters than Chinese to achieve fluency. Based on personal experience and various sources, it takes about 1,000 characters in Japanese and 2,000 characters in Chinese to reach a level of 95% fluency. This is most certainly why people think that Japanese is easier than Chinese, but oh no. If you think that having half the characters to learn is a blessing, then you don't know what secrets they hide. So, in this section, the character dungeon, I will be talking about two things that make this difference of 1,000 characters for fluency so deadly. How the characters themselves are more difficult to learn, and how difficult they are to deal with. To begin, when I say 1,000 characters, I specifically mean kanji, but the problem is, you basically need to learn another 100. The kana. Japanese has 3 writing systems, the Han characters and 2 syllabaries. A syllabary is like an alphabet, but with a consonant and a vowel. Japanese uses both of the syllabaries extensively, even in dictionaries for the Han characters. So if you want to be able to read the character pronunciations, or even form basic sentences, you have to spend time learning the kana. But with Chinese, the first things you're going to see are those Han characters. They're the sole writing system. And as a matter of fact, considering that they are the sole writing system, you'll be seeing a lot more of them a lot more often. Meaning that you might learn them, oh well, twice as fast. Pinyin is literally in the Roman alphabet. It isn't some strange thing that we just can't read. It sounds like it looks, and there are no huge inconsistencies. As a matter of fact, Chinese characters themselves were made more consistent in China just about 70 years ago. In the early 1950s, Mao Zedong realized that everybody was kinda illiterate, so he swam naked in the Yangtze River. No wait, wrong time period. He did do that though. He decided to reform the characters first. Japan did this less than a decade before him. However, they mainly removed characters, which is why you need to learn a lot less characters in Japanese. China made many characters easier to read. However, Japan barely simplified things. If we look at this character, to listen, from traditional Chinese, we can see it's very complex. But in Japan, they removed one of the pieces. However, in China, they made it, well, super duper simple. I think we can agree that it's easier to make this character and remember it early on than it is to remember this one. Now, we're going to move on and talk about why the characters are just bonkers. I mentioned that Japanese has characters with multiple sounds, and they do have multiple sounds. Roughly 60% of all Han characters in Japanese have at least 2 readings, but in Chinese, only about 10% of the characters have 2 readings or more. And in my experience, they're usually just tonal changes and not completely different sounds. You can tell when Japanese uses its alternate sound for a character when the character is in a compound word. This alternate sound is an interpretation of the Chinese sound, and the regular sound is the Japanese sound. Chinese words are often formed with 2 or more characters, so Japanese essentially interprets these compound words as Chinese words, even if it doesn't come from China, and reads it with that Chinese sound. However, what's crazy is that history plays a huge role in these words. The character below in the Japanese word unskillful sounds like hey. However, in the word for subway, it is read as ka. Yes, it's a different sound, even though it's a compound word still. This is because the words are more modern. So this character has to use a more modern sound for those words. While it has a reason to it, it's obvious that this may make things hard to read, as you need to mentally retrace history if you want to read a word right. Oh, and finally, a thing that will make you understand that having less characters doesn't mean it's easier, they don't always follow that compound rule. It is common for words to not fit that idea of if 2 Han characters are together, read them the Chinese way, as a matter of fact. So let's take a look at the characters on the thumbnail of this video. The first word is one person, and is read with the Japanese sounds. It is hitori, when the Chinese sound would be ichinin. So the second word, 2 people, also follows that pattern. It's futari. So that means when we're counting people, we use the Japanese sounds. Okay, so 3 people would obviously fit that pattern too. So it has to be miri. I guess this just means that some compound phrases need to be remembered as using the Japanese sounds. Right? Right? Please. God, no! It's fucking sanin! It uses the Chinese sounds now! It's bonkers! How can you break consistency, then go back to it? Why couldn't they say meaty? And this isn't a single fluke. This even happens in other compound words. The character big can be read as either tai, dai, or o. Tai and dai are the Chinese sounds. But no! It's pretty much a guessing game reading these characters. Take a look at this compound word. Oh, it uses the Japanese sound. Take a look at this non-compound word. Oh, of course, it uses the Chinese sound. Oh, take a look at these compound words. I guess it uses the Chinese sounds now, but wait, why does there have to be tai and dai? Why do they have to be read differently? Like, remember that whole thing I mentioned about how many different readings were taken from different time periods? The word for life has so many that it's ridiculous. The word for birthday, tanjobi, it uses jo. The word for to be born, umareru, it's pronounced u. The word for raw, it's pronounced nama. The word for life, it's pronounced sei. The word for to produce? Oh, of course, it's show. What in God's name were they thinking? This is like having to learn 4,000 characters. It takes over double the effort it would for Chinese characters, at least for me. It's just not reasonable. So, I think you get the point. Japanese has so many readings for these characters that it becomes horrible to deal with real quick. And I think that's the most effective way to explain why Chinese is a lot easier. You can just read the word birthday, for God's sake. But, that's not to say you shouldn't learn Japanese. Japanese is a beautiful language with a beautiful history and so much more to offer. Chinese may be harder for you if you don't care about that easiness provided by the characters. Maybe you want a challenge. And if you do, well, my points are moot. Japanese is the hardest language, for me at least. But for you, maybe Chinese is more difficult than Japanese. But I'm gonna die dogmatic, because did you not see all those characters? What the fuck? Thanks for watching my rant on why Japanese is harder than Chinese. My next video will be on how the printing press ruined the English language. And how it took my baby from me. Thorn! How could Gutenberg do this to you?